Forget the movies. The American frontier wasn't an adventure. It was a 30-year survival horror. If you stood in Dodge City in 1875, you wouldn't feel like a hero. You'd taste the arsenic in the water and smell the rotting grease of a dead horse. Out here, the sunset wasn't scenery. It was a deadline, a warning that the temperature was about to plummet and the law was 100 miles away. This was an industrial machine that chewed up bodies and spat out ghosts. Tonight, we're stripping away the Hollywood filter. If you're ready for the real history, hit subscribe. Because the truth isn't cinematic, it's way worse than you think. The architecture of the deception. In the late 19th century, the American East was undergoing a massive shift. Cities were becoming crowded, soot-covered, and predictable. People were desperate for an escape, not a real one, but a safe, theatrical version of one. William Buffalo Bill Cody. Cody was one of the earliest masters of mass entertainment and myth-making. He didn't just tell stories, he manufactured a reality. His Wild West show was a global phenomenon that turned the gritty, unwashed reality of the frontier into a sanitized, high-stakes circus. He dressed in pristine fringe buckskins that stayed miraculously white, a physical impossibility in the Great Plains mud. He gave the world the noble savage, the quick draw, and the damsel in distress. He created the visual language of the cowboy as a knight-errant on a white horse. But the reality? The cowboy was the lowest rung on the socio-economic ladder. He wasn't a hero. He was a migrant laborer. Take a 17-year-old from a failed farm in Ohio. He's wearing wool trousers that haven't been washed in 4 months. They're stiff with dried sweat, horse dander, and cattle manure. His skin is leathered by UV rays, his lips are permanently cracked, and he's likely suffering from early signs of malnutrition, sometimes even scurvy. He isn't out there for freedom. He's out there because it's the only job that pays $30 a month, most of which goes right back to the rancher for tobacco and cheap grain alcohol. And the worst part, most of them chose to walk into it, the anatomy of a wagon train. We talked about the trail like it was a road trip. It was actually a slow-motion catastrophe. To cross the 2,000 miles from Independence to the Pacific, a family of 4 needed roughly 1,000 pounds of flour, 200 pounds of lard, and 600 pounds of bacon. But here's the problem. The human ego is heavier than a sack of flour. Pioneers packed their entire lives into a space smaller than a modern walk-in closet. They brought family pianos, mahogany dressers, and cast-iron stoves. By the time they hit the Platte River, the physics of the journey failed. The oxen began to collapse from exhaustion, often dying under the strain under the weight of civilization. The solution? Families began jettisoning their heritage into the mud. The trail turned into a graveyard of everything they thought they needed. You would find a $1,000 piano sitting in the middle of a desert, its keys warped by the sun, discarded so the family could carry an extra 10 gallons of brackish water. And then there was the pioneer dust. Imagine 50 wagons in a line. The dust kicked up by the lead team was so thick that the children walking at the back of the line couldn't see their own feet. They breathed this silica-heavy grit for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. It didn't just make them cough, it shredded their lung tissue. By the time many reached Oregon, their respiratory systems were so compromised they would die from the first common cold they encountered in the fall. But starvation wasn't what broke most people, the parasitic reality. Hollywood heroes have perfect teeth and clear skin. The real West was a biological war zone. Because water was more valuable than gold, hygiene was non-existent. You didn't take a bath, you might wipe your face with a damp rag once a week. This made the human body a buffet for parasites. Body lice or graybacks were an absolute certainty. They lived in the seams of your wool clothing. They laid eggs in the heat of your armpits. They bit you until your back and chest were a roadmap of weeping, infected sores. But the real horror was internal. You drank water from a stream where a herd of bison had just waded. Within 2 weeks, you were hosting a tapeworms that could grow several feet long, draining vital nutrients. The medicine? A concoction of turpentine and concentrated lye. You were essentially drinking poison to burn the worms out of your gut. If the dose was too small, the worms stayed. If it was too large, your stomach lining disintegrated. Most pioneers lived in a state of constant, low-grade abdominal agony. their eyes yellowed by jaundice, their bodies wasting away even as they ate everything in sight. And when they tried to escape it, things got even worse. And after a while, this just became normal. The chemistry of the saloon. The strychnine kick. Forget the golden, triple distilled whiskey you see in the movies. Frontier liquor was a chemical assault. Because shipping glass and heavy liquid across the mountains was expensive, local distillers made their own batches using grain alcohol, river water, and anything that could give it a bite. To give the whiskey its amber color, they used burnt sugar or prune juice. To give it a kick, they added plug tobacco, red pepper, or strychnine. Yes, strychnine. In small doses, the rat poison acts as a stimulant that causes a tingling sensation in the limbs. To a dehydrated, overworked miner, that sensation felt like potency. In reality, they were slowly paralyzing their nervous systems. This is why saloons were so violent. This wasn't just outlaw culture. It was often chemical chaos. You had men who hadn't slept in 40 hours, whose guts were filled with parasites and rat poison, being asked to navigate a social environment where everyone was carrying a knife or a heavy piece of timber. The barroom brawl wasn't a choreographed stunt. It was a desperate, staggering explosion of drug-induced rage. The vaquero and the wire. The cowboy wasn't born in Texas. He was born in Mexico. The entire aesthetic, the broad-brimmed hat, the leather chaps, the pointed boots, and the very concept of the lasso was a direct adaptation of the vaquero tradition. For 200 years before an American settler ever touched a cow, Mexican horsemen had perfected the art of open-range ranching. But in this era of the open range, the 20-year window of the great cattle drives was destroyed by a single industrial patent, barbed wire. Before 1874, the West was a commons. You could ride a horse from Canada to Mexico without hitting a fence. But once barbed wire was mass-produced, the Free West became a series of private cages. The wire didn't just stop the cows, it sliced them to pieces. Cattle, used to drifting south to escape the winter winds, would hit a wire fence and stop. They would huddle together in the corner of a fenced pasture, unable to move, and died in massive numbers during brutal winters. In the winter of 1886, the Great Die-Up, the plains were littered with what some accounts described as beef bergs, thousands of frozen carcasses standing upright in the snow, trapped by the very technology that was supposed to make the West civilized. The cowboy didn't ride into the sunset. He spent his final days as a glorified fence mender, clipping wire for a corporation he would never meet. The myth of the gunslinger. How many high noon duels actually happened in the Wild West? Almost none. If you actually tried that in a town like Abilene or Dodge City, you wouldn't get a duel. You'd get arrested before you even reached for your belt. The reality of Western violence was far less noble and far more cowardly. Most people killed in the West were shot in the back, ambushed in dark alleys, or blasted through a window while they were playing cards. There was no honor in a frontier fight. There was only the desire to go home alive. The statistics of peace. Historians have analyzed the homicide rates of the famous cattle towns. In their peak years, towns like Dodge City often saw only a handful of murders per year in its peak period. Compare that to a modern American city, and the Wild West looks like a retirement community. Why? Because the merchants who ran these towns hated violence. Dead customers don't buy whiskey. Towns implemented strict gun ordinances. As soon as you hit the city limits, the sign told you to turn over your shooting irons to the sheriff. You'd get a metal token in return, and you could pick up your weapon when you left town. If you were caught carrying, you were thrown into a cooler, usually a wooden shed with no ventilation until you sobered up. The bank robbery myth. Hollywood tells us outlaws rob banks every Tuesday. In reality, between 1859 and 1900, across 15 states, there were far fewer bank robberies than Hollywood suggests. Surprisingly rare events. 8 in 40 years. Banks were built like medieval dungeons. They were located in the center of town, surrounded by armed citizens and sheriffs. Robbing one wasn't a daring heist, it was a suicide pact. Outlaws like the James Younger Gang found this out the hard way in Northfield, Minnesota, where the townspeople didn't cower. They grabbed their own rifles and virtually wiped the gang out in the street. If you were an outlaw, you didn't rob banks. You robbed stagecoaches in the middle of a 50-mile desert where the only witnesses were the lizards. The medicine of the damned, the poison cure. One of the most dangerous men in any frontier town wasn't the outlaw with a revolver. It was the man with the black bag. In the 1870s, the doctor was often a man who had failed at farming and sometimes held questionable or minimally trained credentials. The chemical assault. If you had an ailment, the doctor didn't look for a cure, they looked for a reaction. They practiced heroic medicine, the idea being that the body needed to be shocked back into health. Calomel. This was the primary treatment for almost everything. It was a mercury-based chloride. It was a massive laxative that caused the patient to salivate uncontrollably, lose their hair, and eventually have their teeth fall out as their gums rotted. The doctors saw this as toxins leaving the body. It was actually mercury poisoning. Laudanum for nerves or female complaints. Doctors prescribed laudanum, a mixture of 10% opium and 90% high-proof alcohol. The frontier was populated by an entire generation of people who were functionally heroin addicts, wandering through their chores in a chemical fog. The sawbones. If you broke a bone or developed an infection, there was no physical therapy. There was the bone saw. Picture the scene, no sterile field. The doctor's apron is stiff with the dried blood of the last 6 patients. To sterilize. The saw, he might wipe it on his pants. There is no anesthesia. You are given a bolt to chew on, literally a piece of lead or wood and a pint of warm grain alcohol. The surgeon's goal was speed. A good sawbones could remove a human leg at the hip in under 60 seconds. You would hear the rasp of the teeth hitting the bone, a sound described by survivors as a wet, rhythmic tearing. If you didn't die from the shock of the amputation, you died 3 days later from hospital gangrene because the doctor hadn't washed his hands since Tuesday. If you're still here, it's probably because you realize the history books skipped the most interesting and terrifying parts. We've still got the truth behind the Great Die-Up, the chemical warfare of the gold mines, and the psychological torture of the Great Plains to get through. If you're finding this value useful, comment grit. If you're still with me, because this only gets heavier from here, below. It helps the algorithm find more people who aren't afraid of the real story. Now, let's get back to the money and the trap. The Boomtown bubble, the debt trap. A miner could work 14 hours in freezing water and end the day poorer than when he started. The dream was to find a nugget the size of a hen's egg. The reality was back-breaking labor in ice-cold water for enough gold dust to buy a single meal. The merchant's trap. The real winners of the gold rush weren't the miners. They were the men selling the shovels. In 1849, San Francisco, a shovel that cost 20 cents in New York was sold for $15. A single egg was $1. A pair of boots was $50. The miners were trapped in an exploitation economy. They would spend 14 hours knee-deep in freezing mountain runoff, buying $3 worth of gold, and then spend $4 on a loaf of bread and a place to sleep. They were losing money every single day they stayed on the mountain. The scrip system. In larger mining operations, companies used the company store system. You weren't paid in U.S. currency. You were paid in scrip, stamped tin, or paper that was only valid at the store owned by the mine. The mine owner would raise the prices of beans and bacon whenever he felt like it. If you tried to leave, you couldn't, because you had no real money to buy a stagecoach ticket. You were a debt slave, trapped in a hole in the ground, breathing in rock dust that would turn your lungs to stone by the time you were 40. The psychology of the plains, prairie madness. We talk about the vast beauty of the plains. To the people living there, it was a sensory deprivation tank, the sound of the wind. On the Great Plains, there are no trees to break the wind. It is a constant, low-frequency howl that never stops. For women trapped in a 10-by-10 sod house, literally a house made of dirt and grass, the wind became a physical weight. It was called prairie madness. People would begin to hallucinate. They would hear voices in the grass. A mother might look at the endless horizon, 360 degrees of nothing, and realize that if her child got sick, help was 3 days away. The sheer crushing weight of that isolation fractured the human mind. The sod house reality. A soddy wasn't a cozy cabin. It was a dirt box. When it rained, the roof leaked mud for 3 days after the storm ended. Centipedes, snakes, and bedbugs lived inside the walls. You ate dirt, you slept in dirt, and you breathed dirt. The stoic look you see in old frontier photos isn't ruggedness, it's clinical depression. The iron horse and the blasting caps. The Transcontinental Railroad is often hailed as the wedding of the rails, a triumph of American unity. But look closer at the track, and you'll see it isn't held together by iron spikes alone. It's held together by the bones of an army of the dispossessed men who were paid in pennies to dance with high explosives. The Chinese labor siege. While the Union Pacific drove west with Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans, the Central Pacific faced the vertical nightmare of the Sierra Nevada. To conquer it, they hired over 12,000 Chinese workers. These men weren't just laborers, they were the expendable engineers. The wicker basket suicide. Imagine being lowered over a 1,400-foot precipice at Cape Horn in a hand-woven wicker basket. Your job is to hammer a hole into solid granite, pack it with black powder, light a short fuse, and pray the men above pull your rope faster than the spark travels. If the wind gusted, you were smashed against the rock. If the fuse was damp, you were vaporized. The liquid death. Nitroglycerin. When black powder proved too weak for the granite, the railroad introduced liquid nitroglycerin. It was so volatile that a simple change in temperature or slight stumble by a porter could, and did, level entire work camps. Because the Chinese workers lived in separate, segregated camps, their accidental deaths were never officially tallied in the company ledgers. Many deaths went poorly recorded or underreported. The Winter of White Death. In 1866, the Sierras were hit with 40-foot snowdrifts. The railroad didn't stop. They forced the Chinese workers to live and work in a labyrinth of tunnels carved under the snow, the living tomb. Entire snow camps were buried by avalanches while the men slept. Their bodies weren't recovered until the spring thaw, often found still clutching their shovels, standing upright in the melting ice. Environmental warfare. The mechanical locust, the iron horse, required a staggering amount of fuel and structural support. The railroad didn't just pass through the West, it consumed it, the deforestation scar. To provide sleepers, the wooden ties that hold the rails, lumber crews stripped every forest within 50 miles of the tracks. The ancient forests of the Sierra and the Rockies were clear-cut, leaving behind a jagged landscape of stumps and ash. The thirst of the engine. A steam locomotive consumes thousands of gallons of water every few miles. In the arid high deserts, the railroad seized every natural spring and creek, effectively killing off local ecosystems and starving out indigenous tribes who had relied on those water sources for millennia. The corporate land grab. This wasn't just about transport, it was the largest real estate heist in history. For every mile of track laid, the government granted the railroad companies up to 20 square miles of land. The railroad became the ultimate landlord, the ultimate law, and the ultimate executioner. It wasn't a bridge between worlds, it was a 2,000-mile scar that bled the continent dry, the law of the lynch. When we think of the law in the West, we imagine a stoic sheriff with a silver star. But in the real frontier, the law was often just a mask worn by a mob. If you were a drifter, a gambler, or simply someone who didn't contribute to the local economy, the arrival of the committee was a death sentence far more efficient than any outlaw's bullet. The merchants' militia. Vigilante committees. Work groups of concerned citizens looking for justice. They were often influenced by the town's wealthiest merchants. In boomtowns like San Francisco or Virginia City, crime was bad for business. If the official courts were too slow or too fair, the business owners took the law into their own hands. The San Francisco Committee of Vigilance. In 1851 and again in 1856, the wealthiest men in San Francisco effectively staged a coup. They bypassed the elected government, arrested their political rivals, and conducted secret trials in a fortified headquarters they called Fort Gunnybags. Order over law. Their goal wasn't to determine guilt in a modern sense. Their goal was to remove undesirables. If you were a poor immigrant or a political dissident, you weren't tried, you were processed. The social event of the scaffold. The most disturbing aspect of the lynch law was its atmosphere. These weren't dark, shameful acts done in the woods. They were public spectacles designed to reinforce the social hierarchy. Family outings. When a hanging was announced, businesses would close. Parents would bring their children, dressed in their Sunday best, to watch a man's life be choked out of him. It was treated with the same festive energy as a county fair. The souvenir trade. After the drop, the mob would surge forward. People would cut pieces of the rope to keep as charms. They would tear scraps from the victim's clothing or even cut locks of hair. These were kept on mantles as trophies, reminders of the day the good people took back their town. The architecture of the hangman. Frontier executions were mechanically brutal. Without a professional hangman to calculate the drop, the physics were almost always wrong. The slow strangle. Instead of the sudden snap of the neck, victims usually suffered through asphyxiation. It could take 10 to 15 minutes of thrashing while the crowd cheered. The bridge as gallows. Because building a proper scaffold took time, any horizontal beam would do. Telegraph poles, bridge spans, and oak trees became the courtrooms of the West. In towns like Hangtown, now Placerville, the very name of the settlement was a marketing tool, a warning to anyone who didn't fit the merchant's vision of order. The Vigilante paradox. The tragedy of the lynch law is that it rarely targeted the big bad outlaws. The Billy the Kids and Jesse Jameses were usually too fast or too well connected. Instead, the rope found the desperate man who stole a loaf of bread, the miner who spoke out against the company script, or the immigrant who looked suspicious. The Wild West wasn't a place of lawlessness. It was a place of hyperlaw, where a dozen wealthy men could decide your fate before the sun went down, with no appeal, no jury, and no mercy. The ecological collapse. The silent frontier. The greatest tragedy of the West was the speed of the destruction. The buffalo slaughter. In 1860, there were tens of millions of buffalo, reduced to only a few hundred in the wild. This wasn't hunting. It was industrial-scale extermination. The U.S. government knew that by killing the buffalo, they were destroying the grocery store, the hardware store, and the religion of the Plains Indians. Passengers on trains would lean out the windows with rifles and shoot buffalo for sport, leaving the carcasses to rot. The plains became a white sea of bleached bones. Eventually, companies went back to collect the bones, grinding them up to make fine china and fertilizer for the very East Coast elite who were reading stories about the beautiful West. It's hard to wrap your head around the scale of that destruction. An entire ecosystem wiped out in less than a human lifetime. We're moving into the final chapters now, uncovering the frozen reality of the Great Die-Up and the psychological breaking point of the frontier. If you've learned something new today that changed how you see America, let me know in the comments. I read every one of them to see which parts of history we should dig into next. The anatomy of the sod house. We need to talk about the physical reality of settling the plains. There were no trees, so there was no lumber. If you wanted a home, you had to cut the very earth beneath your feet. The construction of a dirt box. Imagine taking a breaking plow and cutting 3-inch thick ribbons of buffalo grass. You'd slice them into 2-foot blocks. Each block weighed 50 pounds, held together only by the dense, tangled root systems of the prairie. You stack these like bricks. The roof. More sod, supported by whatever scrap of willow or cottonwood you could scavenge from a dry creek bed. The biological siege. A sod house was a living organism. When it rained, it didn't just leak, it melted. The water would seep through the dirt roof, turning into a chocolate-colored sludge that dripped onto your food, your bed, and your children. Because the walls were made of organic matter, they were a high-rise apartment for the local fauna. The rattlesnake in the wall. It was common for settlers to be woken up by the dry, metallic rattle of a snake that had burrowed into the sod wall to escape the cold. The insect invasion. Centipedes, the size of a man's finger, would drop from the ceiling in the middle of the night. Bedbugs were so prevalent that women would coat the bedposts in kerosene to keep the insects from crawling up to feed. The toxicity of the trail. The chemistry of thirst. The most frequent killer on the Oregon Trail wasn't a bullet or an arrow. It was cholera, and it was a logistical failure of the highest order. The cycle of filth. Thousands of people and tens of thousands of livestock were moving along a single, narrow corridor. They all drank from the same water sources, and they all used those same water sources as a latrine. Cholera is a waterborne bacteria that turns the human digestive tract into a sieve. Within hours of infection, A healthy adult would begin rice water, diarrhea, losing so much fluid that their blood thickened like sludge. Their skin would turn blue, their eyes would sink, and they would die of dehydration while lying in a puddle of their own waste. The alkaline poison. If the bacteria didn't get you, the geology did. As you moved into the high deserts of Wyoming, the water holes became alkali. The water was heavily saturated with salt and potash. To a thirsty man, it looked like a miracle, but drinking it was a death sentence. It would eat the lining of the stomach and kill the oxen where they stood. The trail wasn't just a path, it was a line of white bones and discarded mahogany dressers, stretching for 2,000 miles. The labor of the laundress. We talk about cowboys and miners as the engine of the West. But if the miners were the engine, the laundresses were the filtration system that kept the entire machine from seizing up. In a world of mud, coal soot, and bodily fluids, cleanliness wasn't a luxury. It was the only thing preventing a total plague. The economic powerhouse. In a 1860s mining camp, a man might break his back in a tunnel for $3 a day if he was lucky. A skilled laundress, however, could charge 75 cents per shirt. On a good week, a woman with iron endurance could out-earn the mine owner. But this wasn't easy money. It was a slow-motion suicide. The chemical burn, the lye leach. There was no tide, there was no bleach. To get the ground-in grime of a silver mine out of a wool shirt, you needed a chemical assault. The leach barrel. The process began with a barrel of hardwood ashes. The laundress would pour water through the ash, collecting the brown, caustic liquid that dripped out the bottom. This was potassium hydroxide raw lye, the saponification. She would boil this lye with rendered tallow, animal fat. If the mixture was too strong, the soap would literally dissolve the fibers of the clothing. If it was too weak, it wouldn't touch the grease. The hands of the frontier. Because they spent 12 hours a day submerged in this alkaline solution, a laundress's hands were a horror story. The skin would become parchment thin, eventually cracking into deep, weeping fissures that never healed. They called it the red hand, but it was actually a chemical burn that reached the bone. The 18-hour steam siege. Imagine a 10 by 10 shack in the middle of a Nevada summer. The outside temperature is 95 degrees. Inside, 3 massive cast iron vats are boiling over open coal fires. The lead contamination. The water wasn't pure. In mining towns, the local water was often heavy with lead, arsenic, and sulfur runoff. The laundress was boiling these toxins and breathing them in for 18 hours a day. The scrub board. This wasn't a gentle soak, it was a violent physical labor. They used corrugated zinc washboards. To get a single pair of heavy denim trousers clean, a woman had to exert roughly 30 pounds of downward pressure per stroke, over 1,000 strokes a day. By the age of 30, these women suffered from chronic arthritis and permanent spinal misalignment. The steam lung, the silent killer. The most common cause of death for these women wasn't old age. It was a specialized form of chemical pneumonia. Breathing in a mixture of caustic lye steam and the soot from the coal fires created a layer of sludge in the lungs. It started as a dry cough. Then came the black spit. Eventually, their lung tissue became so scarred and inflamed that they would effectively drown on dry land. The social filtration. The laundress was also the camp's unofficial record keeper. She saw the blood on the shirts from the discreet barroom stabbings. She saw the telltale stains of cholera and dysentery before the doctors did. She knew who was losing weight from consumption and who was spending their gold on laudanum. These women were the biological filters of the frontier, scrubbing the filth, the disease, and the dark secrets of 1,000 men, until their own hearts and their own lungs simply gave out. The brothel, boredom, the sadness of the soiled dove. In the movies, the soiled dove is a witty, well-dressed entrepreneur in a red corset, running a parlor house with a heart of gold. In the real West, she was a prisoner of geography and chemistry. If the cowboy was a migrant laborer, the woman in the brothel was a commodity in a high-turnover, high-infection marketplace. The crib system. While the wealthy elite might visit a parlor house, the vast majority of frontier sex work took place in cribs. The architecture of despair. A crib was essentially a 6 by 10 foot wooden shack with a single door and a window facing the alley. There was no heating, no plumbing, and no privacy. A woman would stand in the doorway day or night in a cycle of revolving door encounters that could reach 20 to 30 men in a single shift. The noise. These districts, like San Francisco's Barbary Coast or Denver's Market Street, were a cacophony of mud-dredging wagons, drunken shouting, and the constant vibrating hum of the machinery from the nearby mines. There was no glamour, only the relentless mechanical repetition of the work, the chemical mask, the lead poisoning. To maintain the illusion of health in a world of scurvy and exhaustion, women used white lead face powder, the toxic glow. This makeup gave them a pale, ethereal look, but the lead was absorbed directly through the skin. It caused neurological damage, abdominal pain, and wrist drop, paralysis of the hands. The premature age. Between the lead makeup, the lack of sunlight, and the constant stress, a woman in her early 20s would often lose her teeth and develop the sallow, sunken features of someone in her 50s. By the time they reached 25, many were considered aged out and pushed further into the fringes of the camp. The medical horror, mercury, and the Great Pox. Venereal disease was the silent shadow of the frontier. Without antibiotics, syphilis was a terrifying multi-stage descent into madness. The mercury cure. Doctors prescribed blue mass pills made of elemental mercury mixed with rosewater and honey. It caused the gums to swell, the breath to smell like rotting metal, and the bones to become brittle. They were literally trade-offing the disease for heavy metal poisoning. The arsenic treatment. In more advanced cases, arsenic was used to dry out the sores. The patient would suffer from violent vomiting and internal hemorrhaging, often dying in a state of total systemic collapse before the syphilis could even reach their brain. The laudanum fog. To survive the physical brutality and the psychological crushing weight of the cribs, the soiled dove relied on the red bottle, laudanum. The addiction cycle. This mixture of opium and alcohol was cheaper than food. It numbed the pain of the infections and the cold, but it also destroyed the appetite. Many women died of simple malnutrition, their bodies so thin and frail they looked like skeletons draped in cheap lace, found in a wooden shack that the town would likely burn down the next day to purify the air. The buffalo bone trade. The industrial aftermath. By the mid-1880s, the Wild West had gone silent. The thunder of 30 million hooves had been replaced by a terrifying hollow quiet. But while the meat had rotted away and the hides had been shipped to Europe to make drive belts for the Industrial Revolution, the plains were still white. They were carpeted in billions of pounds of bleached, sun-scorched calcium. The adventurers were gone. Now comes the necro economy, mining the dead. For the struggling homesteader, the buffalo wasn't a symbol of the spirit. It was a cash crop that required no planting. When the wheat withered in the drought and the grasshoppers ate the corn, the bone picker emerged, the bone wagon. Families would spend weeks wandering the prairie, children tasked with spotting the white glint of a skull in the tall grass. A single wagon could hold about a ton of bones. The bounty. In the 1880s, a ton of bones fetched about $8. That doesn't sound like much today, but to a farmer who hadn't seen a nickel in 6 months, it was a lifeline. It was the bison welfare state. The dead animals were quite literally feeding the people who had replaced them. The logistics of the skeleton. The scale of this operation was industrial. We aren't talking about a few wagons, we are talking about the great bone piles, the railhead mountains. At rail hubs like Dodge City or Wichita, bone piles grew to be 15 feet high and 2 city blocks long. Photographs from the era show men standing on top of mountains of skulls that dwarf the steam engines parked next to them. The tonnage, between 1872 and 1891, it's estimated that over 3.2 billion pounds of buffalo bones were shipped east by rail. That is the skeletal remains of roughly 25 million animals, processed and palletized like lumber. The refining of the East. Where did those billions of pounds of bones go? They went to the bone factories of St. Louis, Detroit, and Philadelphia. They weren't just buried, they were chemically repurposed. Bone black, the sugar filter. The bones were charred in massive ovens to create bone black. This activated carbon was the primary filter for the global sugar industry. Every cube of white sugar that an East Coast socialite dropped into her tea was processed through the charred remains of the American frontier, the fertilizer machine. The rest was ground into bone meal. High in phosphorus, this powder was spread across the exhausted tobacco and cotton fields of the South and the manicured gardens of New England. The dead West was literally the fuel used to resuscitate the dying soil of the East. Fine china. The Victorian irony, perhaps the darkest irony, is the bone china set sitting in your grandmother's cabinet. Fine bone china requires a specific percentage of animal bone ash to give it that translucent, milky white glow and high chip resistance. During the peak of the bone trade, the American buffalo provided the highest quality calcium for the English pottery houses of Spodey and Wedgwood. The very elite who looked down their noses at the uncivilized West were eating their pheasant off plates made from the exterminated remains of the Great Plains' most sacred inhabitant, the ecological erasure. By 1890, even the bones were gone. The plains had been vacuumed clean. This was the final step of the conquest, total erasure. By removing the bones, the settlers removed the last physical evidence that the buffalo and the people who relied on them had ever existed. The land was now a blank slate, ready for the plow, the fence, and the lie. Between 1872 and 1874 alone, railroads carried over 400,000 tons of buffalo bones east. That's not hunting, that's liquidation. The winter of 1888, the school children's blizzard. The climate of the West was a fickle, murderous god. Nothing proves this better than the school children's blizzard of January 12, 1888. The temperature trap. The morning started out strangely warm. People left their houses without coats. Children walked to one-room schoolhouses in their shirt sleeves. Then, at midday, the Arctic Express hit. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in an hour. The whiteout. The wind was so fierce it turned the snow into a solid wall of white. Teachers, trying to lead their students to safety just 50 yards away, got disoriented and walked in circles until they froze to death in the schoolyard. The frozen lung. When you breathe air that is minus 40 degrees while running, the moisture in your breath can freeze in your throat. They found children huddled together in haystacks, frozen solid, just feet away from their own front doors. The West didn't just test your grit, it waited for you to relax and then it extinguished you. We're down to the final acts, the chemical truth of the gold mines and the mechanical failures of the gunslingers. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the grime of history, make sure you're actually subscribed. Over 60% of people who watch these documentaries aren't, and you don't want to miss our next investigation into the dark side of the Industrial Revolution. Stick with us, because the last few secrets are the heaviest. The Diary of the Dust, primary accounts of the Saudi. We often imagine the sod house as a quaint, rustic cabin. Let's look at the actual words of those who lived inside the dirt. The Journal of Sarah Christie Stevens, 1870s. Sarah wrote about the Great Grasshopper Plague, a biological event so massive it blocked out the sun for 3 days. But it wasn't just the crops they ate. Sarah describes the sound, a roar like 1,000 localized fires. The insects descended on the sod houses. Because the houses were made of earth and grass, the grasshoppers began eating the homes themselves. They ate the curtains. They ate the handles off the wooden tools. They even ate the wool off the backs of living sheep. The sensory hell. Sarah's account details the mud rain. When the prairie storms hit, the roof, which weighed several tons, would become saturated. She writes, "I sat at the table with an umbrella over the stove trying to keep the mud from the biscuits, while the children slept under a rubber sheet to avoid being buried in their beds." Imagine the psychological toll of never being clean. Your skin, your hair, your lungs, everything was permanently permeated with the smell of damp, decaying root systems and the ammonia of the livestock living just inches through the wall. The chemical formula of survival. The laundress's war. We've already seen how the laundress fought her war in boiling lye. But the real story isn't the chemistry, it's the economics of that suffering. The economic ledger. In Virginia City, Nevada, a laundress charged $3 to wash a single wool shirt. That was half a day's wages for a miner. Why? Because the labor was lethal. The steam from the boiling lye water combined with the fine silica dust from the mines created a condition called laundress's lung. It was a slow-motion chemical burn of the respiratory tract. These women were the invisible infrastructure of the West, dying of chemical pneumonia, so the heroes could have a clean collar for Sunday service. The architecture of the arrow. Hollywood shows us arrows that thud into a shoulder and the hero pulls it out. That is a biological lie. The mechanical lethality. A Comanche or Sioux war arrow was not a toy. It was designed with a loose head. The flint or iron tip was attached to the shaft with sinew and pine resin. When it hits warm human flesh, the resin would soften. The extraction horror. If you tried to pull the arrow out, the shaft would come away, leaving the serrated head deep inside the muscle or organ. The push-through method. Frontier surgery required the doctor or a friend to push the arrow all the way through the body to the other side, or to use a specialized arrow scoop, a long metal spoon designed to slide alongside the head to prevent the barbs from catching while it was yanked out. The infection rate. War arrows were often dipped in liver rot, a mixture of decayed organ meat and rattlesnake venom. Even a grazing wound resulted in septicemia, blood poisoning, within 48 hours. The screams of a man dying of lockjaw, tetanus from a dirty arrow wound were a constant ambient noise during the Indian Wars. The chemistry of rot gut, the toxic saloon. If you think the whiskey was bad, you haven't seen the worst of it. The recipe for a 19th century binge, base, raw grain alcohol, essentially moonshine. Color. A handful of rusty nails or a plug of chewing tobacco soaked in the barrel to give it that aged brown look. Flavor. Red pepper and oil of vitriol, sulfuric acid. The kick. A dash of strychnine. The result. Strychnine is a powerful stimulant that causes the muscles to twitch. To a man who had been working in a dark, cold hole for 16 hours, that twitch felt like energy returning to his body. In reality, it was the first stage of a seizure. This is why Western saloons had death rooms, a back area where patrons could be thrown to finish their convulsions or sleep off the chemical coma without blocking the bar. The specter of prairie madness, the auditory ghost. The wind didn't just surround you, it got inside your head. The Great Plains have no sound breaks, no hills, no trees. The wind reaches a constant speed and stays there for weeks. Modern psychologists believe the frequency of this wind, infrasound, can cause anxiety, depression, and nausea. Settlers reported that the wind sounded like screaming women or distant artillery. The isolation wall. Men would spend the day in the fields, but women were confined to the soddy. The absolute lack of human interaction, combined with the infrasound of the wind, led to cabin fever in its most extreme form. The break. There are documented cases of extreme cases where isolation led to mental breakdowns and tragedy, and themselves because they couldn't make the grass stop talking. This wasn't a metaphor. Their brains were literally breaking under the weight of an environment the human psyche was never evolved to handle. By this point, survival wasn't about strength, it was about endurance. And even that had limits. The Wild West ended not with a bang, but with a ledger entry. The frontier was closed in 1890 because there was no more empty land to exploit. The people who survived it didn't come back as heroes. They came back with tremors from mercury poisoning. They came back with pioneer lung. They came back with the hollow eyes of those who have seen the industrial-scale destruction of an entire world. When we tell the story of the West, we usually stop at the winning. We never talk about the cost. The cost was 30 million buffalo. The cost was 1,000 years of indigenous culture. The cost was the sanity and health of an entire generation of migrant workers we call cowboys. The sunset looks beautiful, but it's just light hiding what's underneath. But the mud is real, and this is what it actually felt like to stand in it.